Dawn over Arlington. Early winter. The temperature on Arlington Ridge is just below freezing. A thin layer of frost lies on the grass of the surrounding parkland. The American flag at the top of the 78-foot pole is illuminated by a permanent light, as it has been every night since President John F. Kennedy ordered the flag to fly 24 hours a day in 1961. Below the flag, 6 bronze figures of United States Marines and a Navy corpsman strain against the weight of the same pole, captured forever in the act of raising the flag on a small Pacific island 12,000 miles from where their bronze figures now stand. This is the Marine Corps War Memorial. Most Americans call it the Jima Memorial. It stands in Arlington Ridge Park, on federal land just north of Arlington National Cemetery, in Arlington County, Virginia, 2 miles across the Potomac from the Lincoln Memorial. It is the largest bronze statue in the world. The 6 figures are 32 feet tall, more than 5 times life size. The total height to the top of the flagpole is 78 feet. The bronze alone weighs over 100 tons. The granite base, quarried in Sweden and shipped to America in the early 1950s, weighs over 700 tons. The figures hold an actual American flag, not a sculpted one, raised on a real flagpole. The flag is replaced every few weeks as it wears. The memorial commemorates every Marine who has died in service to the country since the founding of the Marine Corps in 1775. It depicts a specific moment from a specific day in 1945. February 23rd of that year, the 10th day of the Battle of Iwo Jima. The day 6 American servicemen raised an American flag on the summit of Mount Suribachi, while a war photographer named Joe Rosenthal stood 10 feet away with his camera. Visitors arrive every day, hundreds of thousands every year. Marines come on the anniversary of the battle. Veterans of every war come to pay respects. Families of fallen Marines come with their children. Tourists come on the Arlington Loop after visiting the cemetery. Most stand in front of the memorial for a few minutes. Most read the inscription that runs around the base, the famous words of Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz about the men who fought on Iwo Jima. Most do not know that the photograph the statue is based on captured the second flag raising that morning, not the first. That 3 of the 6 men in the photograph died on the island within days of the moment the picture was taken. That one survivor was misidentified for 2 years until his own mother forced the federal government to correct the record. That another survivor was misidentified for 70 years and only correctly named in 2016. That a third survivor was misidentified for 74 years and only correctly named in 2019. But this monument was never only a piece of bronze. She is the most American statue in the country, in the sense that she captures a single moment of American service so completely that the moment has become inseparable from the country's idea of itself. She is also the most complicated statue in the country, in the sense that almost every detail of what she depicts has been corrected, revised, or argued over in the 80 years since the moment she preserves. The Austrian-American sculptor who built her spent 9 years working on her without payment. The 6 men she depicts have had their identities corrected 3 times. The American boy from a Pima reservation in Arizona, who survived the flag raising, lived only 10 more years and died of exposure on a freezing Arizona night at the age of 32. This is the story of the most reproduced photograph in American history. The Marine combat photographer who took it and could not have known what he had captured. The Austrian refugee sculptor who saw the picture the next day and knew exactly what to do with it. The 6 men in the image and the country that argued for 80 years about who they actually were. The 3 who died on Iwo Jima within days of the flag raising. The Pima Marine who came home to a country that did not know what to do with him, and the long American work of getting their names right. If you enjoy deep investigations into American monuments and the people who built them, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments which monument you would like me to investigate next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Refugee Who Saw the Picture. Felix de Welden was born in Vienna, Austria, on April 12, 1907. His family was middle class, educated, and Catholic. His father was an industrial engineer. His mother managed the household and encouraged her son's early artistic talents. Felix showed an aptitude for sculpture from his teenage years. He studied at the Vienna Academy of Creative Arts and the University of Vienna, completing degrees in architecture, art, and history by the early 1930s. He became known as a portraitist of Austrian dignitaries and as a sculptor of public memorials in Central European cities. In 1937, with Austrian politics deteriorating and the threat of German annexation approaching, de Welden left Vienna. He went first to Spain, then to England, then to Canada. By 1938, he had arrived in the United States. He settled in the Washington area, set up a studio, and began the slow work of building an American reputation. He became an American citizen in 1945. He had left Vienna, a successful Austrian sculptor. He arrived in America as a refugee who had to start over. By his late 30s, he was one of the rising figures in American academic sculpture. When the United States entered the Second World War in December of 1941, de Welden enlisted in the Navy. He was 34 years old, established, and could have stayed out of military service. He volunteered. He was assigned to the Navy as a combat artist, attached to the Bureau of Naval Personnel. His job was to produce official artistic records of Navy operations, portraits of Navy heroes, and sculptural memorials for various Navy and Marine Corps purposes. He spent the war years at the Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland, producing dozens of bronze portrait busts, several large reliefs, and various other pieces that the Navy and Marine Corps requested. On February 24, 1945, the morning after Joe Rosenthal's flag-raising photograph appeared in American newspapers, Felix de Welden saw the image in the Washington morning papers. The picture had been transmitted by wire from the Pacific the previous night. It was being printed across the country on the front page of nearly every American daily. De Welden would later say in interviews that he understood, on first sight of the photograph, that this image would become the central American image of the Second World War. He sat down in his studio the same day. He made a small clay model of the figures from the photograph. The model took him most of the afternoon and into the evening. He worked from the news photograph and from his memory of the figures. He produced a sculpture about 3 feet tall, capturing the angles and the masses of the original image. He showed the model to his Navy supervisors the next day. They were impressed. The Navy commissioned de Welden to develop a larger version of the sculpture for the war bond fundraising tour that was being organized around the 3 survivors of the flag raising. The original wartime sculpture, completed in May of 1945, was 12 feet tall. It was made of plaster, painted to look like bronze. It was used on the 7th War Loan Tour through the summer of 1945. Tens of millions of Americans saw it at war bond rallies, parades, and public events across the country. The 3 survivors of the flag raising appeared with the statue at most events. The combination of the photograph, the statue, and the men was one of the most successful fundraising campaigns in American history. The tour raised over $26 billion in war bonds, equivalent to several $100 billion today. After the war ended in August of 1945, de Welden began the project that would consume the next 9 years of his life. The Marine Corps had decided that the photograph and the moment it captured deserved a permanent bronze memorial. The Corps wanted de Welden to build it. He agreed. He set up a studio in Washington dedicated to the project. He worked on the monument from 1945 until its dedication in November of 1954. He received no salary for those 9 years. The Marine Corps League and the Marine Corps Reserve raised the money for the bronze, the granite, the casting, and the construction. De Weldon worked for the honor of doing the work. He was paid eventually, after the dedication, in the form of a fee from the Marine Corps League. The fee was modest compared to the value of what he had produced. The wound that built the Iwo Jima Memorial is the wound of an Austrian Catholic refugee who arrived in America in 1938 with nothing but his training, became an American citizen during the war, served the country that had taken him in, and spent 9 years of his American working life on a single sculpture that he believed honored the country and the Marines who had died for it. De Weldon was not a Marine. He was not a combat veteran in the traditional sense. He was a sculptor who had been an Austrian and became an American and wanted to give the country a memorial worthy of what its sons had done. He died in 2003 at the age of 96. He lived to see his monument become one of the most visited federal sites in the country. He had given America something. The country had given him a country. The exchange was fair. Chapter 2. The hill above the cemetery. The site where the Marine Corps War Memorial now stands is Arlington Ridge, a gentle elevation in Arlington County, Virginia, about 1.5 miles west of the Potomac River. The ridge runs north to south, parallel to the river, and provides views eastward across the river toward Washington. The memorial sits at the northern end of the ridge, at an elevation of about 200 feet above the river, just north of the boundary of Arlington National Cemetery. The land has a deep American history. In the 18th century, the Arlington estate belonged to the Custis family. George Washington, Parquet Custis, the step-grandson of George Washington and the grandson of Martha Washington, inherited the land in the 1790s and built Arlington House on the higher ground south of the current memorial site. Custis lived there for over 5 decades and used the property as both a working plantation and a public memorial to Washington's legacy. His daughter Mary Anna Custis inherited the property at his death in 1857. She had married a young Army officer named Robert E. Lee in 1831. When Lee resigned from the United States Army in 1861 to serve the Confederacy, the federal government seized the Arlington estate for non-payment of property taxes, a legal mechanism the government used to take possession of strategically important land in Northern Virginia early in the Civil War. The estate became a federal military property. Union troops camped on the grounds throughout the war. In 1864, with the Union dead from the Virginia campaigns of that year overwhelming the existing cemeteries in Washington, the federal government designated the Arlington grounds as a national cemetery. The first burials took place that spring. The cemetery has continued ever since. The land around the cemetery, including the ridge where the memorial now stands, remained federal property. It was used for various Army and Navy facilities through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Fort Myer, the Army post on the southern part of the property, was established in 1863 and continues today. The northern slopes of the ridge, where the memorial would eventually be built, remained as parkland with various federal uses. The selection of the Arlington Ridge site for the memorial took several years of discussion. The Marine Corps League, the private veterans organization that was organizing the project, considered several locations. Sites in Washington proper were ruled out due to the limited available federal land and the strict design controls on monuments within the district. Sites at the Marine Corps Base Quantico, about 40 miles south of Washington, were considered but rejected as too remote from the heart of the capital region. The Arlington Ridge site offered 3 advantages. The elevation provided a commanding view of Washington. The proximity to Arlington National Cemetery connected the memorial visually to the burial ground of so many Marines. And the federal ownership of the land simplified the legal and political processes of placement. The selection was approved by Congress in 1947. The site was specifically the northern slope of the ridge on land that had been part of the Arlington estate since the 1790s. The memorial would stand on land that had been owned by the family of George Washington's wife. The connection was not accidental. The Marine Corps League members involved in the selection process noted explicitly that placing the memorial on this land tied the Corps to the founding history of the country through the Washington family connection that had been preserved in the Arlington estate. Construction at the site began in 1951. The land had to be graded and prepared. A massive concrete foundation was poured to support the weight of the bronze figures and the granite base. The granite was shipped from Sweden in blocks of 10 to 20 tons each and was set in place over the foundation through 1952 and 1953. The bronze figures, cast in Brooklyn at the Betty Mackey Art Foundry, were transported by truck and rail to the site in 1954 for assembly. The final installation was completed in October of 1954, about 3 weeks before the dedication on November 10th. The land choice was a layered American choice, a federal monument to the Marines, placed on land that had been seized from the family of the Confederate commander, on the boundary of the cemetery that had been started during the Civil War in order to honor the Union dead, looking eastward across the Potomac at the city the Marines had been founded to defend. The connections went back to the founding generation. The country was making a statement about continuity. The monument was being placed on ground that connected the Marines to the deepest layers of American history. The choice was deliberate. The choice has held. Chapter 3. The photograph that became the design. The Marine Corps War Memorial is the only major American national monument that was designed from a single photograph. The photograph in question was taken by Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press at approximately 1 p.m. on February 23, 1945, on the summit of Mount Suribachi on the Pacific island of Iwo Jima. Rosenthal was the son of Jewish immigrants from Russia. He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1911. He had grown up in San Francisco, started as a newspaper reporter, and moved into news photography in the 1930s. He had tried to enlist in the military when the war broke out, but had been rejected for poor eyesight. He worked as a war correspondent instead, photographing for the Associated Press through the Pacific campaigns. He had photographed the landings at Guam, Peleliu, and now Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was a small volcanic island about 660 miles south of Tokyo. The island was about 8 miles square, with Mount Suribachi rising 546 feet at its southern end. The Japanese had fortified the island heavily. The American invasion began on February 19, 1945, with 70,000 United States Marines landing on the southeastern beaches. The battle would continue for 36 days. Almost 7,000 Americans would die. Almost 20,000 Japanese soldiers would die, most of them on the island. The American forces fought northward from the landing beaches. Mount Suribachi was the dominant terrain feature. The mountain had to be taken first. On the morning of February 23rd, a Marine patrol from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, climbed the mountain and reached the summit without major resistance. They raised a small American flag at the top at about 10:30 that morning, an act of personal triumph and a signal to the troops below that the summit had been taken. This was the first flag raising. The first flag was about 54 by 28 inches, a standard American military flag. It was raised by a group including Henry Hansen, Boots Thomas, Charles Lindbergh, James Michels, and Louis Charlot. A Marine combat photographer named Lou Lowry photographed the first flag raising. His photograph showed Marines around a small flag, with a Japanese pipe being used as the flagpole. Several hours later, the battalion commander on the ground, decided to replace the first flag with a larger one. The reason was practical. The larger flag would be more visible from the beaches below, where the bulk of the Marine force was still fighting. The smaller flag would be taken down and preserved as a battle trophy. A second flag was brought up the mountain with a longer Japanese pipe to use as the new flagpole. The replacement was a routine operation. The men assigned to do it were Michael Strank, Harlan Block, Franklin Sousley, Harold Schultz, Harold Keller, and Ira Hayes. Joe Rosenthal had climbed the mountain that morning with Bill Genost, a Marine combat motion picture cameraman, and Bob Campbell, another Marine combat photographer. The three men were near the summit when the second flag was being prepared. Rosenthal saw the Marines about to make the change. He stepped back to get a better angle. He raised his camera as the men began to raise the second flag. He snapped one frame. The shutter speed was 1/400th of a second. The aperture was about 11. Rosenthal did not have time to compose carefully. He took the picture, advanced the film, took another picture as the men gathered around the raised flag, and then took several more shots of various groups of Marines posing near the flag. He did not know which of his frames would turn out well, if any. The photograph was sent by wire to the Associated Press in San Francisco that night. The next morning, February 24th, the image appeared in newspapers across the United States. The composition was perfect. The 6 figures pushing the flagpole forward, the angle of the bodies, the sky behind them, the diagonal of the pole, the suggestion of motion. The picture captured the moment in a way that no posed photograph could have. It became the most reproduced photograph in American history within weeks of its first publication. The fact that this was the second flag raising rather than the first was not immediately known to the American public. The first flag raising had been the moment of triumph. The second flag raising was, in practical terms, a routine flag replacement. But Rosenthal's photograph was so visually powerful that it overwhelmed the first flag image. The country embraced the second flag photograph as the symbolic moment of victory. Felix de Weldon, working from this single photograph, designed the entire memorial. His full-size sculpture is, in essence, the photograph rendered in bronze. The angles of the figures, the position of the flagpole, the relationships between the bodies, all match the photograph in precise detail. De Weldon had to invent only what was not visible in the original image, primarily the backs of the figures, the boots, and the small details that the photograph could not show. He used the 3 survivors as models for those figures. For the 3 dead Marines, he used what photographs and physical descriptions he could find. The result was the most faithful translation of a single photograph into monumental sculpture in American history. The critics who existed at the time were few. Most Americans accepted the design immediately. A handful of art critics argued that founding a national memorial on a single news photograph was a category error, that monuments should be designed from sculptural traditions rather than journalism. The Marine Corps League ignored the critics. The country wanted a memorial that looked exactly like the photograph it had fallen in love with. De Weldon provided exactly that. The monument that resulted is, in a deep sense, the country's tribute not just to the men in the photograph, but to the photograph itself, and through it to Joe Rosenthal, the son of Russian immigrants who took the most American picture ever made. Chapter 4. The Hands That Made Her. The construction of the Marine Corps War Memorial involved several hundred workers across 9 years of design, casting, transportation, and installation. The workforce was spread across multiple sites in the United States and Sweden. The story of who built her is a story of mid-20th century American industrial craftsmanship at its best, drawing on immigrant traditions, federal organization, and Marine Corps determination to get the job done right. Felix de Weldon's primary studio was in Washington, near his home. He employed a small team of assistants who helped with the clay modeling, the plaster casting, and the various technical tasks of preparing the original full-size models. The team included American sculptors of various backgrounds. Some had trained in Italian-American sculpture traditions. Some came from the Washington art world. A few were younger Marine veterans who had returned from the Pacific and were working in art-related fields after the war. De Weldon paid them out of his own pocket during the 9 years he worked on the project. The Marine Corps League reimbursed him after the dedication, but during the actual work years, he was personally responsible for the studio expenses. The full-size models were made of plaster, life-size for individual figure studies, then 5 times life-size for the final memorial scale. Working at 32 feet tall required scaffolding, hoists, and a workshop with high ceilings. De Weldon rented a large industrial space in southwest Washington for the final modeling work. Several of the figures were modeled separately and then assembled to verify their relationships before being shipped to the foundry. The 3 living survivors of the flag raising posed for De Weldon in person. Ira Hayes, Rene Gagnon, and John Bradley each spent extended periods at De Weldon's studio in 1945 and 1946. They were not paid for the modeling work but were given expenses for travel and accommodations. The 3 men were photographed extensively, measured precisely, and asked to hold the positions of their respective figures for hours at a time. The discomfort of the work, particularly for men who had recently been in combat and who were struggling with what would later be called post-traumatic stress, was significant. None of them complained on the record. They wanted the memorial done right. The 3 deceased Marines were sculpted from photographs and physical descriptions provided by their families. Michael Strank, Harlan Block, and Franklin Sousley had all died on Iwo Jima within weeks of the flag raising. Strank was killed by friendly fire on March 1st, 1945. Block was killed by mortar fire on March 1st, 1945. Sousley was shot by a sniper on March 21st, 1945. None of them had been photographed in the precise positions required for the memorial. De Weldon worked from whatever images of the men he could obtain, supplemented by descriptions from their families and from surviving Marines who had known them. The casting was done at the Betty Mackey Art Foundry in Brooklyn, New York. The foundry was operated by 2 Hungarian-American brothers, Alajos and Lajos Bedi, who had emigrated to America in the early 20th century and had built one of the most respected art foundries in the country. The Bedi brothers specialized in monumental bronze casting. They had cast major sculptures for various American sites for over 2 decades by the time the Marine Corps War Memorial Commission came to them in the late 1940s. The casting process took nearly 3 years. Each of the 6 figures was cast in multiple sections. The figures had to be hollow to keep the weight manageable. The bronze was a high tin alloy chosen for durability and weather resistance. The total bronze used was approximately 110 tons. The foundry employed about 30 workers at peak production on the memorial project. The crew was a mix of Hungarian-American, Italian-American, and Irish-American craftsmen, with several African-American workers on the heavy labor crews. The Brooklyn foundry workers earned good wages by the standards of mid-century American industrial labor. Skilled bronze casters earned about $15 a day. Common laborers earned about $8 a day. The workforce was unionized through the various metal trades unions of New York. The work was hot, physically demanding, and required precise attention to the casting tolerances. The foundry kept careful records. The names of the principal workers on the memorial project are partially preserved in the Betty Mackey records, though many of the day-to-day workers are recorded only by first name or by union number. The granite base was quarried in Sweden at the Karlsham quarry, which specialized in the dark black granite known as Swedish ebony. The Marine Corps League selected the Swedish granite over American options because of the deep black color, which would provide a strong visual contrast with the bronze figures. The granite blocks were shipped from Sweden to New York and then transported by rail and truck to Arlington. The base was set on the foundation in 1953. The inscriptions, including the names of the principal Marine Corps engagements and the famous Nimitz quote about Iwo Jima, were carved into the granite by stonemasons working at the site. The installation crew at Arlington Ridge included about 60 workers at peak. The crew was a mix of Marine Corps engineers, civilian contractors, and specialized sculpture installation craftsmen. The bronze figures were assembled on site, lifted into position by cranes, and bolted to the granite base. The flagpole was installed last, in late October of 1954. The American flag was raised for the first time on the new memorial on October 31st, 1954, 11 days before the official dedication. The names of most of these workers are not widely known. The Marine Corps records of the project preserve some names. The Betty Markey Foundry records preserve others. The full picture of who built the memorial requires drawing on multiple sources, and even then the picture is incomplete. The country built one of its most important monuments through the combined efforts of hundreds of Americans, immigrant and native-born, white and African-American, Marine and civilian, sculptor and laborer. Most of them are not remembered by name today. The monument they built is one of the most visited federal sites in the country. The exchange is the exchange that has built most American monuments. The country remembers the work. The work itself remembers the workers. In the bronze that still stands. Chapter 5. The 9-year project. The technical construction of the Marine Corps War Memorial took 9 years from initial commission to dedication. The work proceeded through 5 distinct phases. The design and modeling phase from 1945 to 1949. The casting phase from 1949 to 1952. The site preparation phase from 1951 to 1953. The granite installation phase in 1953. The bronze installation phase in 1954. Each phase had its own engineering challenges, its own setbacks, and its own dramatic incidents. The design phase began with de Welden's small wartime model and progressed through increasingly larger versions. The 12-foot version used on the Warbond tour in 1945 was the first major-scale model. After the war ended, de Welden began working on the 32-foot full-scale figures. The scale-up was not simple geometric enlargement. Sculptures at monumental scale require structural calculations that small sculptures do not. The figures had to be designed to support their own weight in bronze. The angles of the limbs, the projections of the rifles and the flagpole, the various unsupported elements had to be calculated to ensure that the final bronze would not break under its own weight or under the wind loads of an outdoor location. De Welden worked closely with engineers from the Bureau of Naval Personnel and later with private structural engineers to refine the figure designs. The original photograph showed certain dramatic angles that, when scaled up to monumental size, would have created mechanical problems in bronze. The figures had to be adjusted to maintain the visual impression of the photograph while being structurally sound at 32 feet tall. The adjustments were subtle. Most visitors today cannot tell that the figures are not perfectly faithful to the photograph in every detail. The adjustments were necessary, engineering compromises that kept the visual impact intact. The casting phase at the Betty Markey Foundry produced the bronze figures in approximately 108 separate pieces that would be assembled at the memorial site. The largest single piece was the figure of Ira Hayes, cast in 12 sections. The smallest pieces were the rifles and the smaller equipment items, cast individually. The casting tolerances had to be extremely tight. Each piece had to fit precisely with the pieces around it to maintain the seamless appearance the design required. The foundry produced numerous test castings before committing to the final figures. Several early test castings were rejected for visible defects in the bronze surface. The foundry remade the rejected pieces at its own expense. The site preparation phase began in 1951. The Arlington Ridge location was an active parkland with mature trees, irregular terrain, and existing utilities that had to be respected. The Marine Corps engineers worked with the National Park Service, which has jurisdiction over the surrounding parkland, to design the site work to minimize disruption to the existing trees and pathways. A concrete foundation was poured to support the memorial. The foundation was 4 feet thick and extended below the frost line, designed to support the combined weight of the bronze figures and the granite base. With allowances for wind loads in the small but real ground movements of the Arlington area, the granite installation in 1953 involved approximately 60 individual stone blocks. The largest blocks weighed over 20 tons each. The blocks had to be lifted into position by crane and set with precise alignment to maintain the geometric proportions of the base. The mortar between the blocks was a specialized formula designed to remain flexible enough to accommodate small temperature movements without cracking. The stonemasons who did the work were a mix of American and Swedish craftsmen. The Swedish workers had come over with the granite shipment and stayed to ensure the installation matched the standards of the quarry. The collaboration was effective. The granite base has held without significant maintenance issues for over 70 years. The bronze installation in 1954 was the dramatic phase. The 6 figures arrived from Brooklyn in October. The assembly took about 3 weeks. The figures were placed in position using a large mobile crane that had to be brought in from a New York rigging company. The bronze pieces were welded together in some locations and bolted in others, with all the joints carefully concealed to maintain the smooth bronze surface. The flagpole was the last element to be installed. Once the flagpole was secured, the American flag was raised, and the memorial was visually complete. There were several dramatic incidents during the construction. In 1952, a section of the foundry in Brooklyn caught fire during a bronze pour. The fire was contained quickly, but several days of work were lost. In 1953, a granite block dropped during installation at the Arlington site and cracked when it hit the ground. The block had to be replaced from the Swedish quarry, delaying the granite phase by several weeks. In October of 1954, during the bronze assembly, a young marine engineer named Charles Reeve was injured when a falling tool struck him on the upper-level scaffolding. He recovered fully but was hospitalized for 2 weeks. He attended the dedication on crutches. The cost of the memorial reached $850,000 in 1954 dollars, equivalent to roughly $10 million in present-day money. The entire amount was raised by private donations from individual Marines, Marine Corps Reserve units, the Marine Corps League membership, and Friends of the Marine Corps. No federal funds were used for the construction of the memorial itself. The federal contribution was the land, the site preparation supervision, and the perpetual maintenance after dedication. The pattern was the American pattern. Private American citizens raised the money to build their own monument to their own service. The federal government provided the ground and the long-term care. The combination produced a memorial that has stood for over 70 years and shows every sign of standing for many more. Chapter 6. The Cold Morning in November. The Marine Corps War Memorial was dedicated on November 10, 1954, the 179th anniversary of the founding of the United States Marine Corps. The weather was cold. A light frost lay on the grass of Arlington Ridge Park that morning. The temperature in the Washington area was in the 40s Fahrenheit. The sky was overcast with occasional patches of weak November sunlight. The ceremony was held in the open air at the base of the newly completed memorial. The official delegation was extensive. President Dwight Eisenhower presided over the dedication. He had been in office for less than 2 years. He had served in the Army during World War II but had a deep appreciation for the Marine Corps. He gave the keynote address. The Vice President Richard Nixon attended. The Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson attended. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Lemuel C. Shepard, Jr., presided over the Marine Corps elements of the ceremony. The Joint Chiefs of Staff attended. Hundreds of other federal officials, members of Congress, and senior military officers attended. The most important guests, in many people's view, were the three surviving men from the flag-raising photograph. Ira Hayes had traveled from Arizona. Renee Gagnon had traveled from New Hampshire. John Bradley had traveled from Wisconsin. The three men were seated together in the front row of the dignitary section. They were in their 30s. They had all survived the war and built civilian lives since. Each of them carried the visible weight of having been in the photograph that had defined their post-war existence. Families of the deceased Marines also attended. The mothers and fathers of Michael Strank, Harlan Block, and Franklin Sousley were brought to Washington at federal expense to be present at the dedication. Belle Block, the mother of Harlan, was particularly notable. She had fought a 2-year battle with the federal government from 1945 to 1947 to have her son correctly identified in the photograph. The Marine Corps had initially identified the figure that was actually Harlan Block as Sergeant Henry Hansen, a Marine who had died on Iwo Jima. Belle Block had recognized her son in the photograph and had insisted to the Marine Corps that the identification was wrong. After 2 years of investigation, the Marine Corps had agreed with her in January of 1947. She was now sitting in the front row at the dedication of the monument that depicted her son correctly because of her persistence. Felix de Weldon was there with his family. He sat near the front, watching the ceremony at the conclusion of his 9 years of work. He was 47 years old. His sculpture, which he had begun as a small clay model in his studio the morning after Joe Rosenthal's photograph appeared in the papers, was now permanently installed on a hill in Arlington. He gave brief remarks during the dedication. He thanked the Marine Corps for the commission, the families of the men depicted, and the Betty Mackey foundry workers. He did not dwell on his own contribution. He was a quiet man at his moments of personal triumph. Joe Rosenthal attended as well. He was 43 years old. He had won the Pulitzer Prize for photography in 1945 for the original photograph, the year it was taken. He had spent the intervening decade defending himself against repeated false accusations that the photograph had been staged. The accusations were not true. The photograph had been a genuine, spontaneous shot of a routine flag replacement that happened to produce one of the great photographs of the 20th century. Rosenthal had refused to capitalize on the photograph beyond his normal work as a news photographer. He had not written a book about it. He had not sold the rights for profit. He had treated the image as something that belonged to the country, not to him. He sat in the audience at the dedication as one of the audience members rather than as a featured guest. He was a modest American journalist watching his work be honored. President Eisenhower's address was brief and direct. He spoke about the Marine Corps as one of the oldest military services in the country. He spoke about the price of liberty and the willingness of American servicemen to pay that price. He spoke about the specific Battle of Iwo Jima as one of the most costly campaigns in the history of the Marine Corps. He named the dead. He acknowledged the living. He paid tribute to Felix de Weldon for his 9 years of work. He dedicated the memorial to the memory of every Marine who had died in the service of the United States since the founding of the Corps in 1775. The Marine Corps Band played. The Marine Corps Honor Guard fired a 21-gun salute. The American flag at the top of the 78-foot pole was raised to full mast. The ceremony lasted approximately 90 minutes. The official delegation moved by motorcade back to Washington for a reception at the White House. The public was then allowed to approach the memorial freely. What was said on November 10, 1954, was what could be said at a moment of pure national tribute. What was not said is part of the record too. The complications around the identification of the figures in the photograph, the second flag raising versus the first, the personal struggles of the three survivors, the costs that the war had imposed on the men depicted and on their families. All of that lay underneath the formal ceremony. The memorial had been dedicated. The country had paid its tribute. The harder conversations would happen in the decades to come. Chapter 7. The First Generation. For the first 2 decades after her dedication, the Marine Corps War Memorial was a beloved fixture of the Washington area landscape. Visitors came in steady numbers. The memorial became one of the most photographed sites in the Arlington region. Marines made pilgrimages on the anniversary of the battle. Veterans of all wars came to pay respects. The memorial earned its place in the American visual imagination quickly and held it permanently. The flag-raising ceremony took place every day. The flag flew from sunrise to sunset in accordance with the original protocols. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy signed an executive order designating the Marine Corps War Memorial as one of a small number of federal sites where the American flag would fly 24 hours a day. The designation required permanent illumination of the flag at night, which was installed in 1961 and has been maintained ever since. The flag at the top of the 78-foot pole has not been lowered at sunset for over 60 years. It flies continuously, illuminated through the night by floodlights at the base. The 3 living men from the photograph had different relationships with the memorial in the years after the dedication. René Gagnon attended several Marine Corps events at the memorial in the late 1950s and 1960s. He worked at a series of civilian jobs in New Hampshire and Massachusetts and gave occasional interviews about the flag raising. He died of a heart attack in 1979 at the age of 54. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, within walking distance of the memorial. His headstone identifies him as one of the flag raisers. John Bradley returned to Wisconsin after the war, became a funeral director, married, raised 8 children, and refused to discuss the flag raising for most of his life. He did not attend most of the public events related to the memorial. He told his children that the heroes were the ones who did not come home. When he died in 1994, his children discovered boxes of letters and documents in his home that revealed how heavily the war had weighed on him. His son James Bradley wrote a book called Flags of Our Fathers based on these documents. The book was published in 2000 and became a bestseller. It was adapted into a film by Clint Eastwood in 2006. The book and film became, for 2 decades, the dominant popular account of the flag raising. Ira Hayes had the most difficult post-war life of the 3 survivors. His story is the subject of a later chapter. He died in 1955, less than a year after the memorial was dedicated. He was 32 years old. The memorial itself became, in the late 1950s and 1960s, a site of regular Marine Corps ceremonies. The Marine Corps held its annual birthday celebrations there. Promotions to senior ranks were sometimes conducted in front of the memorial. Newly commissioned officers brought their families to see it. The memorial became part of the institutional life of the Corps in a way that few monuments do. The civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 1960s did not directly involve the memorial, but the broader cultural changes of the era did affect it indirectly. The story of Ira Hayes, the Pima Native American Marine who had returned home to poverty and died of exposure, became more widely known during the 1960s through Johnny Cash's song The Ballad of Ira Hayes, recorded in 1964. The song was a hit and brought Hayes' story to a national audience that had not previously known the details of his post-war life. The memorial began to be understood by a portion of the American public as not only a tribute to victory, but also as a reminder of the costs that victory had imposed on the men depicted. The Vietnam War era brought additional complexity. The memorial sat physically adjacent to Arlington National Cemetery, which was filling with new graves from Vietnam through the 1960s and early 1970s. The memorial's connection to the Marine Corps was direct. The Marines suffered heavily in Vietnam. The mood at the memorial during the Vietnam years was different from the mood at the dedication. The memorial was no longer simply a celebration of victory. It had become, increasingly, a place of grief. The first major maintenance work on the memorial was performed in the late 1960s. The bronze had developed surface corrosion. The granite base had developed minor cracks at several joints. The federal government allocated funds through the National Park Service for cleaning and repair. The work was completed without incident. The memorial was closed to visitor approach for several weeks during the work, then reopened. The visiting public adjusted easily to the brief closure. By the early 1970s, the memorial was an established fixture of the Washington area. Almost no American adult had not seen photographs of it. Many had visited in person. The memorial had become, in less than 2 decades, one of the most recognizable American monuments in the world. Felix de Weldon was still alive and producing other works. He visited the memorial regularly. He would do so for the next 3 decades, until shortly before his death in 2003. Chapter 8. The War That Followed. The Vietnam War, fought from the mid-1960s through the early 1970s, was the external shock that most fundamentally changed the way the Marine Corps War Memorial was understood. The memorial did not change. The country around it did. The gap between the memorial's message and the reality of the war in Vietnam produced a complicated reframing of what the bronze figures actually represented. When the memorial was dedicated in 1954, the country was in the early years of the Cold War. The Korean War had recently ended. The Second World War was less than a decade in the past. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima were the heroes of the Central American military achievement of the 20th century. The memorial was understood as a tribute to victory, to American military success, to the willingness of American servicemen to do what needed to be done. The Vietnam War complicated all of these understandings. The war was not won. The Marines fought there as hard as they had fought on Iwo Jima. They suffered heavily. They were not, in many cases, treated with respect when they returned home. The Marine Corps casualty figures from Vietnam included almost 15,000 Marines killed. The memorial, sitting on Arlington Ridge during the years of the Vietnam War, became a place where these new deaths accumulated in the public consciousness alongside the older deaths of the Pacific. The cultural reframing happened gradually. The memorial's message of victory remained intact in some readings. The memorial's message of cost became more prominent in other readings. The bronze figures, straining to raise the flag, were no longer simply a representation of triumph. They became a representation of effort, of difficulty, of the weight of the country's military burden. This dual reading was helped by the broader popularization of Ira Hayes's story. Johnny Cash's song from 1964 had brought Hayes's tragic post-war life to a national audience. The film The Outsider, released in 1961 starring Tony Curtis, had told a fictionalized version of Hayes's story. The country was learning that the men in the photograph had not all returned home to triumph. 3 had died on Iwo Jima within days of the photograph. 1 had died less than a year after the memorial was dedicated. The cost was not abstract. The cost was specific Americans with specific names. The Vietnam War accelerated this understanding. American servicemen were dying in a war that the country could not figure out how to win and could not figure out how to end. The Marine Corps War Memorial, viewed against this backdrop, became more emotionally complex. The figures were still pushing the flag forward. The flag at the top still flew 24 hours a day. But the meaning had layered. The bronze figures were now also representing the Vietnam Marines who had not yet been given their own memorial. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, designed by Maya Lin and dedicated in 1982, would eventually give the Vietnam dead their own monument on the National Mall. But for the 17 years between the start of major American combat in Vietnam in 1965 and the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the Marine Corps War Memorial functioned partly as a stand-in. Veterans visited it. Families of the Vietnam dead visited it. The bronze figures absorbed meaning that had not been part of their original purpose. The memorial became, in this period, the central physical site for honoring American Marines who had died in all of the country's 20th century wars. The country's complicated relationship with the Vietnam War continued to evolve through the 1970s and 1980s. The memorial reflected the changes. Anniversary ceremonies at the memorial in the late 1970s and early 1980s often included specific tributes to Vietnam veterans. The Marine Corps used the memorial as the site of various reconciliation events. The bronze figures held still through all of this. The country processed its difficult feelings about Vietnam at the foot of a memorial that had been built to honor the unambiguous victory of an earlier war. The events of September 11th, 2001, added another layer. The Marine Corps would fight in Afghanistan from late 2001 and in Iraq from early 2003 through the rest of the decade and beyond. New Marine casualties accumulated. The memorial absorbed these as well. The names on the granite base of the memorial were the names of the major Marine engagements through 1954. They did not include Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, or Iraq. The memorial's official inscriptions are frozen in time. The memorial's emotional meaning continues to evolve as the country adds new conflicts and new casualties to the legacy of the Marine Corps. What the memorial shows now is different from what it showed in 1954. The figures have not moved. The flag still flies. The bronze still stands on the same granite base. But the country has been pouring decades of additional grief and pride and complicated feeling into the same physical monument. The memorial absorbs all of it. That is what monuments at their best do. They give the country a place to put its feelings, year after year, war after war, generation after generation. The Marines on the ridge will keep absorbing for as long as the bronze holds. The bronze will hold for a very long time. Chapter 9. The Pima Marine. Ira Hamilton Hayes was born on January 12, 1923, on the Gila River Indian Community Reservation in Arizona. The reservation, established in 1859, was home to the Pima people, a tribe that had lived along the Gila River in central Arizona for centuries. The Pima had traditionally been farmers, growing corn, beans, and squash, with sophisticated irrigation systems that predated European contact. The arrival of American settlers in the late 19th century, along with the diversion of Gila River water for federal irrigation projects, had collapsed the Pima farming economy. By the early 20th century, the Pima were among the poorest groups in the American Southwest. Ira Hayes was the oldest of 6 children of Nancy and Joseph Hayes, both members of the Pima tribe. His father worked as a farmhand and laborer. His mother kept the household. The family was poor but stable. Ira attended the Phoenix Indian School, a federal boarding school that operated from 1891 to 1990. The school's pedagogy was assimilationist, designed to remove Native American children from their tribal cultures and prepare them for participation in mainstream American economic life. Ira was a shy student, a good reader, and showed a particular interest in athletics. He graduated from the school in 1942. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps Reserve on August 26, 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor. He was 19 years old. He volunteered for paratrooper duty and completed jump school at Camp Pendleton in California. He served with the Marine Paratroop Battalion in the Pacific from 1943 onward. He was in combat at Bougainville. By the time the invasion of Iwo Jima was being planned in early 1945, Hayes was a corporal in Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines. The Iwo Jima landings began on February 19, 1945. Hayes was in the third wave to land on the beach. Easy Company fought northward toward Mount Suribachi over the next 4 days. On February 23rd, Hayes was among the men who climbed Suribachi for the flag replacement. He was one of the 6 men who raised the second flag. Joe Rosenthal photographed him from about 10 feet away. Hayes did not know he had been photographed until much later. The Battle of Iwo Jima continued for another month after the flag raising. Hayes fought through the rest of the battle. He survived. He was one of 3 men out of the 6 in the photograph who survived. The other 3 were Michael Strank, killed by friendly fire on March 1st. Harlan Block, killed by mortar fire on March 1st. Franklin Sousley, killed by a sniper on March 21st. In April of 1945, Hayes was rotated home, along with Rene Gagnon and John Bradley, the other 2 survivors, to participate in the 7th War Loan Bond Tour. The 3 men spent the spring and summer of 1945 traveling across the United States. They appeared at parades, fundraising events, war bond rallies, and other public appearances designed to raise money for the war effort. The tour raised over $26 billion. The 3 men became, briefly, among the most famous American soldiers of the war. The tour was a difficult experience for all 3 survivors. None of them wanted the attention. All 3 felt that the dead Marines, not the living ones, deserved the honors. Hayes, in particular, had difficulty with the public role. He was a shy man from a small reservation community. He had never spoken in public before. He had to give brief remarks at dozens of events. He had to shake hands with strangers, sign autographs, and pose for photographs constantly. The strain was visible to people who knew him. The drinking began during the Bond Tour. Hayes had not been a heavy drinker before the war. He started drinking heavily during the tour as a way to manage the social anxiety and the survivor's guilt that was already beginning to set in. The Marine Corps tried to manage the problem, but could not. He was discharged from the Marine Corps in December of 1945 with the rank of corporal. He returned to the reservation in Arizona. The transition was harsh. The reservation was poor. The job opportunities were limited. Hayes worked as a farmhand, a cotton picker, and various other agricultural labor jobs that paid little and offered no advancement. He drank heavily. He was arrested multiple times for public intoxication, more than 50 times in total over the next decade. He was sometimes jailed for short periods. He was sometimes hospitalized. He was always released back to the reservation. He traveled to public events occasionally. He attended the Iwo Jima Memorial dedication in November of 1954. He spent time with the other 2 survivors. He posed for photographs with Felix de Weldon. He was polite, quiet, and visibly uncomfortable in formal settings. On the night of January 23, 1955, less than 3 months after the memorial dedication, Hayes drank heavily at a card game in Sacaton, Arizona. He left the game late at night and tried to walk home in temperatures that dropped to 27 degrees Fahrenheit. He never made it home. His body was found the next morning in a shallow ditch about a quarter mile from the card game. The cause of death was exposure complicated by alcohol intoxication. He was 32 years old. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by thousands of Marines and federal officials. He was buried with full military honors. His grave is located about a mile from the memorial that depicts him forever as a 22-year-old Marine helping to raise the American flag. The two locations are within easy walking distance of each other. Visitors can see his grave and the bronze figure that represents him on the same afternoon. Johnny Cash recorded the Ballad of Ira Hayes in 1964. The song was written by Peter Lafarge. It told the story of Hayes's life in plain language and brought his story to a national audience. The song was a hit in 1964 and remains one of Cash's most performed works. The Pima Marine, who had helped to raise the flag and had come home to a country that had not figured out how to take care of him, became, through the song, a figure in American popular memory. The country had failed him in some ways. The country had also memorialized him in bronze and in song. Both are part of what the country is. Both are part of the record. Felix de Weldon kept a private copy of the photograph he had used to model the figure of Ira Hayes. He kept it in his studio for the rest of his life. He would later say in interviews that he thought about Hayes often during the years he was working on the memorial. He did not know, when he was modeling the figure in 1947 and 1948, that Hayes would not live long enough to grow old. De Weldon lived until 2003. He saw decades of Hayes's life that Hayes himself never got to live. He felt the loss personally. He spoke about it in interviews well into his 90s. The Pima Marine had given the sculptor a face to work from. The sculptor had given the Pima Marine a permanent place in American memory. The exchange held. Both men, in their different ways, had served the country that had asked them to serve. Chapter 10. The Names We Got Wrong. The modern conversations about the Marine Corps War Memorial cluster around three topics: the misidentifications of the men in the photograph, the relationship of the memorial to the broader Marine Corps history, including more recent conflicts, and the long-term preservation of the bronze and the granite. The misidentifications are the most complicated and most uniquely American of the three topics. The first misidentification involved Harlan Block. The figure, now identified as Block, was originally identified as Sergeant Henry Hansen, a Marine who had also been in the patrol that climbed Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945. The mistake was made in the chaos of the days immediately following the photograph. The Marine Corps released the names of the 6 men based on initial reports from the battlefield. Hansen had been killed on March 1, 1945, the same day Block was killed. Both men were assumed by the original identifiers to have been in the photograph. Block's body was returned to his family in Texas. Hansen was credited with being in the photograph. Belle Block, Harlan's mother, recognized her son in the news photograph immediately. She wrote to the Marine Corps to inform them of the mistake. The Marine Corps initially dismissed her concerns. She persisted. For 2 years, from early 1945 through January of 1947, she wrote letters, made phone calls, and pressed her case. Her congressman in Texas became involved. The Marine Corps eventually conducted a formal investigation. In January of 1947, the Marine Corps confirmed that Belle Block had been correct. The figure was Harlan Block, not Henry Hansen. The correction was made on the public record. The Felix de Weldon sculpture, which had been started in 1945, had to be partially redone to reflect the correction. De Weldon worked from photographs of Block provided by the family. He modified the sculpted figure to match the actual Marine. The corrected sculpture was completed in time for the 1954 dedication. Belle Block sat in the front row at the dedication, watching the unveiling of the memorial that correctly depicted her son because of her 2 years of refusal to accept the official Marine Corps identification. She lived until 1963. She visited the memorial regularly through the last years of her life. The second misidentification involved John Bradley. The figure that had been identified as Bradley for over 70 years was actually a Marine named Harold Schultz. Bradley had been in the first flag raising earlier that morning but was not in the second flag raising that Rosenthal photographed. Bradley himself, who lived until 1994, had never spoken publicly about the photograph. He had refused interviews and had not corrected the record. His family had assumed for decades that he was in the photograph because that was what the Marine Corps record said. The re-identification came in 2015 and 2016, primarily through the work of two amateur historians named Eric Krell and Stephen Foley. Krell was a toy designer in Omaha, Nebraska. Foley was an Irish researcher who had developed a deep interest in the Iwo Jima photograph. Working independently and then collaboratively, they noticed that the figure, identified as Bradley, had a number of physical details that did not match Bradley but did match Harold Schultz. They compared the photograph with other photographs from Iwo Jima and built a case that the man in the second flag raising was Schultz, not Bradley. The Marine Corps conducted a formal review of the Krell and Foley research in 2015. The review confirmed the identification. In June of 2016, the Marine Corps publicly announced the correction. The figure that had been identified as Bradley for 71 years was Harold Schultz, who had died in 1995 at the age of 75. Schultz had never publicly claimed to have been in the photograph. He had once told a stepdaughter at a family dinner that he was one of the men who raised the flag, but he had not pursued the claim. He had lived his post-war life as a postal worker in Los Angeles, modestly and without fanfare. His correction came 21 years after his death. The third misidentification involved René Gagnon. The figure identified as Gagnon was actually a Marine named Harold Keller. The re-identification came in 2019, also through the work of amateur historians, this time including Brent Westemeyer, Stephen Foley, and Dustin Spence. The case was similar to the Schultz case. Physical details did not match Gagnon, but did match Keller. The Marine Corps confirmed the identification in October of 2019. Harold Keller had died in 1979 at the age of 47, 20 years after the war and 40 years before his correct identification. Like Schultz, Keller had lived modestly and had not pursued any claim to the photograph. He had told family members that he had been there. The family had not pursued formal recognition. The correction came too late for Keller himself to know, but the official record was finally accurate. The three corrections, made over 74 years, represent something specific about how America has worked through the meaning of this memorial. The country did not get the names right the first time. The country has been correcting them ever since, often through the work of family members and amateur historians who refused to let the official record stand without challenge. Bell Block in 1945, Eric Krell and Stephen Foley in 2015, Brent Westemeyer and Dustin Spence in 2019. Each correction was made through the same process. Americans noticed something wrong. They pursued the question. The federal government, when the evidence was clear, agreed and corrected the record. That is how the country handles questions of memory. Slowly, imperfectly, always with corrections still possible. The work continues. There may be additional corrections that future researchers will identify. The memorial will be available to receive them. The bronze figures will not change. The names attached to them will continue to evolve. Chapter 11. The cost of keeping her. The Marine Corps War Memorial is part of the George Washington Memorial Parkway, a unit of the National Park Service that includes the surrounding parkland. The memorial itself is federal property, maintained by the Park Service through its regular operating budget. The total budget for the George Washington Memorial Parkway unit runs in the range of $20 to $30 million per year, covering all parkway operations, all of the parkland, the various smaller memorials, and the Marine Corps War Memorial specifically. The Marine Corps War Memorial receives a fraction of this total in normal operating costs. Annual maintenance, security, lighting, and basic operations run in the range of $100,000 to $200,000 per year. The bulk of the operating budget goes to staffing the surrounding parkland, maintaining the parkway roads, and operating the various other small memorials and visitor sites in the unit. Major restoration events are funded separately through special appropriations or private donations. The most recent major restoration, completed in 2017, cost approximately $5.4 million. The funding was a private donation from David M. Rubenstein, the Washington area philanthropist whose donations have funded restoration work at several federal monuments. The Rubenstein donation covered the entire cost of the 2017 restoration. The work included cleaning the bronze, repairing weather damage, restoring the granite base, and improving the visitor infrastructure around the memorial. The visitor experience at the memorial is free. There is no admission charge. The memorial is accessible at all hours, with floodlighting at night. The flag at the top flies 24 hours a day. Visitors can walk up to the memorial, around it, and stand at the base. Many people who visit also walk the short distance to the adjacent Netherlands Carillon, a gift from the Netherlands government in 1954 for American assistance during World War II, or proceed to Arlington National Cemetery on the southern side of the ridge. The Marine Corps maintains a separate honor guard presence at the memorial during ceremonial occasions. The annual Sunset Parade is performed at the memorial during summer months. Members of the Marine Corps drill team and ceremonial detachment perform a coordinated drill demonstration in front of the memorial every Tuesday evening. From June to August, the parades are free and open to the public. They draw thousands of visitors over the summer season. The economic impact of the memorial on the surrounding region is substantial, but difficult to isolate from the broader Arlington and Washington tourism economy. Visitors to the memorial typically also visit Arlington National Cemetery and the various Washington monuments. The combined visitor flow supports local hotels, restaurants, and tourism businesses in Arlington and the district. The Marine Corps War Memorial is one node in a network of federal sites that together drive tens of millions of dollars in annual tourism activity. The David M. Rubenstein donations deserve a separate paragraph. Rubenstein has been one of the most generous private donors to American federal monuments over the past 2 decades. His donations have supported restoration work at the Washington Monument, the Jima Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, Arlington Memorial Bridge, and various other federal sites. The pattern of significant private donations to federal monuments reflects an American tradition that goes back to the original Washington Monument fundraising in the 1830s. Wealthy Americans contributing to the upkeep of national monuments is one of the ways the country has always maintained its public infrastructure. The pattern continues and is likely to continue. The 78-foot flagpole and the actual flag that flies on it represent an ongoing cost that most visitors do not think about. The flag is large. It is exposed to weather. It wears out. The Park Service replaces the flag every several weeks under normal conditions, more often in periods of high wind or storms. The flag is donated in most cases by private organizations, including Marine Corps units that adopt the memorial for a specific replacement. The illumination of the flag at night requires electric service and bulb replacement on a regular schedule. The combined costs of the flag and the illumination run in the range of tens of thousands of dollars per year. Future investments will be needed. The bronze will continue to weather. The granite will require periodic repair. The internal supporting structure will need ongoing maintenance. The Park Service estimates that the memorial will require capital investment in the range of $5 to $10 million over the coming decades to maintain it at current standards. The federal government will likely continue to fund routine maintenance. Major restoration projects are increasingly likely to be funded through private donations following the Rubenstein pattern. The bargain works. The American public gets one of its most beloved monuments maintained at world-class standards through a combination of federal appropriations and private generosity. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima would, the Park Service materials suggest, appreciate the arrangement. Chapter 12. What the bronze shows. Step back from the misidentifications and the conservation budgets and the long stories of the men depicted. Stand on Arlington Ridge on a clear morning. Look at the 78-foot-tall bronze. Look at the American flag at the top of the pole. Ask what the memorial shows the country that built her. She shows a country that takes its time getting the names right. The first misidentification was corrected in 2 years through the persistence of a Texas mother. The second was corrected in 71 years through the persistence of amateur historians in Nebraska and Ireland. The third was corrected in 74 years through similar persistence by independent researchers. Each correction came through the same process. Americans noticed something wrong. They pursued it. The federal government, when the evidence was clear, accepted the correction. The country has been quietly improving the accuracy of this memorial for 80 years. The work continues. Other corrections may be made in the future. The country handles its memory the way it handles most things, in pieces, over time, with patience and stubbornness in roughly equal proportions. She shows the long American work of receiving immigrants and turning them into Americans. Felix de Welden was Austrian. Joe Rosenthal was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. The Betty brothers who cast the bronze were Hungarian immigrants. The granite came from Sweden. The Italian-American, Hungarian-American, and Irish-American workers at the Brooklyn foundry built the actual bronze. The Pima Marine in the photograph was from a tribe that had been on this continent for centuries. The country drew on all of these strands to build her most American monument. The American character includes all of them. The memorial documents, the inclusion. She shows that monuments serve as places for the country to put its grief. The memorial was dedicated in 1954 to commemorate the dead of the Pacific War and through them the dead of all Marine Corps engagements. The Vietnam War added new layers. The Persian Gulf War, the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War, and the various other military engagements of the past 5 decades have all added their own layers. The memorial absorbs grief without changing physically. The bronze figures still strain to raise the flag. The flag still flies 24 hours a day. The country brings its sorrows to this site and leaves them at the base of the granite. The memorial holds them all. That is what monumental sculpture, at its best, can do. She shows the role of single images in shaping American memory. Joe Rosenthal's photograph from February 23, 1945, is one of the most reproduced images in human history. It has appeared on postage stamps, on currency, in school textbooks, in countless reproductions in museums and homes. The memorial is the photograph in bronze. The photograph made permanent in 3 dimensions. The photograph translated into a form that visitors can approach physically. The American visual imagination has been shaped by single images more than by long arguments. The Rosenthal photograph and the de Welden memorial together form one of the most successful American examples of this pattern. The image and the bronze reinforce each other across the decades. She shows the importance of patient American craftsmanship. The memorial took 9 years to build. Felix de Welden worked without payment for those 9 years. The Betty Mackey foundry workers cast over 108 separate bronze pieces with the precision required to assemble them seamlessly. The Swedish granite workers shipped 20-ton blocks across the Atlantic. The site preparation, the foundation work, the installation crews, all worked at a level of craftsmanship that produced a memorial that has stood for over 70 years without major structural issues. The country builds monuments at this level when the country decides the work is worth doing. The Iwo Jima Memorial is evidence of what American craftsmanship can produce. She shows the costs that the country has imposed on its servicemen, and the long American work of acknowledging those costs. 3 of the 6 men in the photograph died on Iwo Jima within days. Ira Hayes survived the war and died less than a year after the memorial was dedicated, of exposure on a freezing Arizona night. John Bradley survived the war and spent the rest of his life refusing to talk about it. René Gagnon survived the war and died young at 54. The 2 newly identified survivors, Harold Schultz and Harold Keller, lived modest lives and never sought public recognition. The country has done what it can for these men. Bronze at Arlington, burials at the cemetery, songs about Ira Hayes, books about John Bradley, corrections to the official record. None of it brings back the dead. All of it acknowledges what they gave. The acknowledgement continues. Looking up at her on a clear morning from the parkland north of Arlington National Cemetery, you see 6 bronze figures pushing an American flag forward. You also see, if you have learned the history, all the corrections and the songs and the books and the corrections still being made. The bronze does not move. The country continues to learn what it depicts. That asymmetry is part of what makes the memorial worth visiting. She does not change. The country changes. The country brings its changing understanding back to her, year after year, and she stays the same, and the country grows up to her, slowly, generation by generation. She is the country in bronze. The country is still becoming what the men she depicts were already doing on February 23, 1945. Chapter 13. The Futures We Will Choose. The future of the Marine Corps War Memorial is more secure than the future of most American monuments. She is not the subject of removal campaigns. She is not the focus of major legal disputes. She is universally beloved by the Marine Corps, by veterans of all services, and by the broader American public. Her future is mostly about maintenance, interpretation, and the slow work of presenting her to a changing country. The first set of decisions concerns physical preservation. The bronze will continue to weather. The granite will require periodic repair. The flagpole will need maintenance and eventual replacement. The internal structural elements will need ongoing monitoring. The Park Service has a long-term capital plan that addresses these needs. No urgent conditions threaten the memorial. The maintenance schedule is predictable. The second set of decisions concerns the question of whether to add the names of more recent Marine Corps engagements to the granite base. The current inscriptions stop at the Korean War, the most recent major engagement at the time of the dedication in 1954. The memorial does not list Vietnam, the Persian Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, or the various smaller operations of the past 7 decades. Various proposals have suggested adding these names, either through additional granite plaques or through reinterpretation of the existing inscription panels. The Marine Corps has generally been conservative about modifications. The memorial as dedicated in 1954 is the memorial that exists. Modifications would alter the historical integrity of the original. The decision has been made, so far, to leave the inscriptions as they were originally cut and to use educational materials to acknowledge the more recent engagements. The decision may be revisited. The third set of decisions concerns the misidentifications and how they should be acknowledged in the visitor experience. The current Park Service approach is to update interpretive materials at the memorial whenever a correction is made and to include the corrections in the standard tour scripts. The Schultz and Keller identifications have been incorporated into the interpretation. Future corrections, if any, will be similarly incorporated. The bronze figures themselves cannot be relabeled in the traditional sense. The figures remain anonymous in the sculpture itself. The interpretation around them is where the names and corrections live. The fourth set of decisions concerns the relationship of the memorial to Arlington National Cemetery. The cemetery is adjacent to the memorial. Many of the Marines whose service the memorial commemorates are buried in the cemetery, including Ira Hayes, Renee Gagnon, John Bradley, and Harold Schultz, all of whom received military burials in Arlington. The two sites function together in the visitor experience but are administered by different federal agencies. The cemetery is under the Department of the Army. The memorial is under the National Park Service. The agencies coordinate but do not share management. Future improvements to the visitor experience may include better integration of the two sites. The fifth set of decisions concerns the broader question of how the memorial should be presented to a country that increasingly does not have personal memories of the Second World War. The veterans of the Pacific War are almost all gone. Their children are aging. The grandchildren of the Iwo Jima veterans are now adults. The great-grandchildren are growing up. Each generation of Americans encounters the memorial with less direct connection to the war it commemorates. The Park Service has been working to update interpretive materials, educational programs, and visitor experiences to keep the memorial meaningful for new generations. Future updates will continue. The work of teaching new Americans about the war their great-grandfathers fought never ends. The sixth set of decisions, the most speculative, concerns the broader visual culture of American military memorialization. The Marine Corps War Memorial is unusual in being based entirely on a single news photograph. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the World War II Memorial, the Korean War Veterans Memorial, and the various other 20th century military memorials in Washington have used different formal vocabularies. The future of American military memorial design will reflect the visual culture of the country at the time of future construction. The Iwo Jima Memorial has set a standard that has not been matched by subsequent memorials. Future memorial designers will continue to study her. The memorial herself will continue. She has stood through every major event of American history since her dedication in 1954. The Cold War, Vietnam, the end of the Cold War, the various wars of the post-9/11 era. She has not changed. The country around her has and continues to. The asymmetry between the durability of the bronze and the changing context of her interpretation is part of what makes her useful. She gives the country a stable reference point against which to measure its own changes. In 50 years, in 100 years, in 200 years, she will still be there. The bronze will be older. The American flag at the top will still fly 24 hours a day if the country continues to honor the order President Kennedy signed in 1961. The names attached to the figures may continue to evolve as researchers identify additional corrections. The country around her will be different in ways no one can predict. The 6 bronze figures pushing the American flag forward will still be there, on Arlington Ridge, looking eastward across the Potomac at the city the Marine Corps was founded to defend. Chapter 14. Her place in the larger story. The Marine Corps War Memorial is part of a network of military memorials in the Arlington and Washington area. Placing her in context helps the viewer understand what she shares with other works and what makes her one of a kind. The most direct comparison is Arlington National Cemetery itself. The cemetery, established in 1864, contains over 400,000 graves of American servicemen and their families. The cemetery is the country's central burial ground for military personnel. The Marine Corps War Memorial sits on the boundary of the cemetery and is functionally part of the same memorial complex from a visitor experience standpoint. The two sites together commemorate American military service in a way that no other location in the country does. The tomb of the unknown soldier within Arlington National Cemetery is another comparison. The tomb was established in 1921 and contains the remains of unidentified American soldiers from the major 20th century wars. The tomb is guarded 24 hours a day by the Old Guard of the 3rd United States Infantry Regiment. The tomb and the Marine Corps War Memorial together function as the two Central American military commemorative sites. The tomb represents the unidentified dead. The memorial represents a specific identified moment of American military achievement. The two sites are complementary. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial on the National Mall, designed by Maya Lin and dedicated in 1982, is a different formal vocabulary for military commemoration. The Vietnam Wall is sunken into the ground, made of polished black granite, and lists the names of the 58,000 American dead from the Vietnam War. The Vietnam Wall and the Iwo Jima Memorial together represent two completely different approaches to military memorialization. The Iwo Jima Memorial is heroic, vertical, bronze, and based on a single moment. The Vietnam Wall is contemplative, horizontal, granite, and based on accumulated names. Both work. The country needed both approaches at different moments in its history. The National World War II Memorial on the National Mall, dedicated in 2004, takes yet another approach. The memorial is a circular plaza with columns representing each state and territory that participated in the war, surrounding a central fountain. The memorial is sometimes criticized for being more architectural than emotional. The Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, in contrast, is intensely emotional. The two memorials together commemorate the same war from different angles. The Korean War Veterans Memorial on the National Mall, dedicated in 1995, uses statues of soldiers in a different way than the Iwo Jima Memorial. The Korean War Memorial features 19 stainless steel statues of soldiers moving through terrain, reflected in a granite wall that contains photographic images of military personnel from the Korean War. The approach is more narrative and less iconic than the Iwo Jima Memorial. Both represent valid American approaches to memorializing 20th century wars. A second pattern involves the use of news photography as a basis for sculpture. The Iwo Jima Memorial is the most prominent American example of this practice. The Memorial of Liberation at Yad Vashem in Israel is based on a different war photograph. The Mother Russia statue at Mamayev Kurgan in Volgograd is based on Soviet propaganda imagery rather than a specific photograph, but uses similar visual conventions. The American practice of building monumental sculpture from news photographs is relatively rare, but has produced powerful results. A third pattern involves the use of allegorical figures versus identifiable individuals in memorial sculpture. The Iwo Jima Memorial depicts 6 specific identified Marines, even if the identifications have required multiple corrections. The Statue of Liberty depicts an allegorical figure. The Statue of Freedom on the Capitol depicts an allegorical figure. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial uses neither figures nor allegory. The American memorial tradition includes all of these approaches. The Iwo Jima Memorial is at one end of the spectrum, with maximum specificity. The Statue of Liberty is at the other end, with maximum allegory. Both work for their purposes. Across these patterns, the Marine Corps War Memorial stands as a particular kind of monument. Photographic in origin, heroic in mode, specific in identification, continuously corrected over decades. Beloved across the American political spectrum, she is, in this sense, one of a kind. She is also part of a longer tradition of American military memorialization. Both descriptions are accurate. The American memorial landscape is rich and varied. This channel is working its way through it, monument by monument. Each one has its own version of the questions she raises. Each is part of the larger story. Chapter 15. The evening on the ridge. Evening on Arlington Ridge again. Early winter. The temperature is dropping toward freezing. The sun has dropped behind the office towers of Rossland to the north. The Potomac is gray in the early dusk. Arlington National Cemetery just to the south is closing for the day, and on the 78-foot flagpole on the ridge, the American flag is illuminated by the floodlight that came on automatically as the sky darkened. Below the flag, 6 bronze figures of United States Marines and a Navy corpsman strain against the weight of the same pole, captured forever in the act of raising the flag on a small Pacific island 12,000 miles from where their bronze figures now stand. You see her differently now. You know about Felix de Weldon, the Austrian Catholic refugee who arrived in America in 1938, became an American citizen in 1945, served in the Navy as a combat artist, and spent 9 years of his American working life on a single sculpture. You know about Joe Rosenthal, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants, the news photographer who took the picture from 10 feet away with 1/400th of a second exposure on February 23, 1945, who refused to capitalize on the photograph for the rest of his life. You know about the 6 men in the picture: Michael Strank from Czechoslovakia, Harlan Block from Texas, Franklin Sousley from Kentucky, Ira Hayes from the Pima Reservation in Arizona, Harold Schultz from Detroit, identified 71 years after the fact, Harold Keller from Iowa, identified 74 years after the fact. You know that Strank, Block, and Sousley all died on Iwo Jima within days of the photograph. You know that Ira Hayes died 10 years later of exposure on a freezing Arizona night at the age of 32. You know about Belle Block, the Texas mother who fought the federal government for 2 years to have her son correctly identified. You know about Eric Krell and Stephen Foley and Brent Westemeyer and Dustin Spence, the amateur historians who corrected the record for Schultz and Keller in 2016 and 2019. You know about Johnny Cash and the Ballad of Ira Hayes. You know about James Bradley and Flags of Our Fathers. You know about the 9 years de Weldon worked without pay, the Brooklyn foundry where the bronze was cast, the Swedish quarry that supplied the granite, the November 10th dedication in 1954 with President Eisenhower. The same memorial, looking back at you across Arlington Ridge, holds all of that. Who really paid for her? The American Marines who donated to the Marine Corps League fundraising drive, the Marine Corps Reserve units that contributed, the Friends of the Corps who sent checks, the Hungarian-American foundry workers in Brooklyn, the Swedish granite quarrymen, the Austrian-American sculptor who worked for 9 years without a salary, the federal taxpayers who have maintained her since dedication, David M. Rubenstein, who funded the 2017 restoration. Each of them paid in a different currency. The country has been paying her maintenance for 70 years. What does she ask of the country now? Maybe to keep correcting the names. Maybe to know that Harold Schultz and Harold Keller were as much in the photograph as anyone else, even though for decades the country thought otherwise. Maybe to remember Ira Hayes, the Pima Marine from Arizona, who came home from the most successful American military campaign of the 20th century to a country that could not figure out how to take care of him. Maybe to recognize that Felix de Weldon, the Austrian refugee, gave America one of her most American monuments out of gratitude to the country that had taken him in. Maybe to stand on Arlington Ridge on a cold evening and look up at the bronze figures and the flag they are raising and know that the United States Marines are still in the world, still doing the work the men in the bronze did on that morning in February of 1945. What will the next generation do with her? They will visit. They will read the inscriptions. They will know more than this generation does, because the work of recovering the history continues. They will maintain her. They will pay the federal appropriations and the private donations that keep her standing. They will pass her on to the generation after them. The bronze will outlast every observer who looks at her tonight. The floodlights are full on now. The bronze figures are visible from a half-mile away through the November dusk. The flag is illuminated at the top. The Arlington National Cemetery is dark to the south, but the white marble headstones catch the light from the parkway. The Potomac is a darker gray than the sky. The lights of Washington are coming on across the river. She is our memorial. She has been ours since November of 1954. She will be ours for as long as the Ridge stands and the Republic stands and the country has the will to take care of what it values. She honors every Marine who has died in service to the country since 1775. She honors specifically the 6 men of February 23, 1945, even when the country took 74 years to get all 6 names right. She honors Felix de Weldon, the Austrian refugee who made her. She honors Joe Rosenthal, the photographer who captured the moment she preserves. She honors Bell Bloch and the amateur historians who made sure the record was eventually accurate. She is the country in bronze. She is one of the most American things this country has ever built. She belongs to all of us. She belongs to the Marines most of all, and through them to every American who has ever served, and through them to every American who has ever been protected by their service. If you enjoy deep investigations into American monuments and the families and movements behind them, please like this video and subscribe. Tell me in the comments which monument I should investigate next. The Lincoln Memorial, the Gateway Arch, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, or something forgotten that deserves to be remembered. Every monument has a shadow. Every shadow has a story. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next investigation.